This talk is about natural learning environment practices. We're going to look at sensory preferences and how they support inclusion. My name is Winnie Dunn, and I'm a distinguished professor at the University of Missouri in the United States. Let's look at this picture. Look at all the different ways that children are responding to the rich sensory environment of this park and all the activities that are going on. We all have the smart expertise to support children in all environments, no matter what their sensory preferences are. So we're going to look tonight at some activities and environments and how we can make adjustments in those to support children to participate in a way that is satisfying for them and their families. This is Dunn's sensory processing framework. It's made up of two basic constructs. Let's look at them. First, we have the neurological thresholds, which is a neuroscience construct about how fast the neuron systems fire based on input. At the low end, people notice a lot of sensory input because their neurons notice a lot and they fire a lot. They have low thresholds. And at the high end, people have to get a lot of information to get their neurons to fire. So we say they have high sensory thresholds. The second core construct is self-regulation, which goes from left to right. Self-regulation goes from passive to active. Passive self-regulation means people let things happen and then they react, while active self-regulation means that people engage in behaviors to control the amount of sensory input they're getting, to either get more or to get less. Seeking is a combination of high thresholds and active self-regulation. People that are seekers enjoy sensory input and get a lot of pleasure out of it, and so they do things to try to get more sensory input throughout the day. Avoiding has active self-regulation just like seeking, but avoiders have low sensory thresholds, so their brains are geared to detect a lot of things. And when their brain detects novelty, it tends to go into fight or flight, seeing all sensory input that's unpredictable as potentially harmful or dangerous. Sensitivity has low thresholds, just like avoiding, but passive self-regulation. So people with sensitivity notice a lot, but they try to participate and then get overwhelmed. And finally, registration is high neurological thresholds like seekers, but they have passive self-regulation. So they don't engage in behaviors to go after more sensory input. They just kind of hang below their thresholds. They're easygoing, but they miss things. The sensory processing patterns that we just discussed reflect brain activity. We know from a growing body of literature that there is a relationship between what patterns a person exhibits and how their brain activity works. When we're in practice, we don't have the opportunity to check brain activity, so it's great to have these studies to validate that our behavioral observations are matching with differential and distinct brain activities. Let me just show you one example. In 2007, Davies and Gavin did a study with about 50 children. About half of the children had typical performance on sensory processing patterns, and about half of the children had differences in their sensory processing patterns from what we would expect. You can see on the slide a bar graph showing the differences in their sensory processing scores on the short sensory profile. They conducted EEG brain activity with the children, and the EEG brain output discriminated the groups with 86% accuracy when the brain activity analysis was done by people that did not know what the sensory processing scores were. So this is an example of validation that the sensory processing patterns that we're testing are actually reflecting differentiation in the brain's activity. So let's look at each pattern in more detail. Seekers always want more. Remember, seeking reflects high thresholds and active self-regulation. Look at this little boy. He is getting a lot of joy out of the foam and the water and the sand splashing up all around him. He is going after more sensation. People that are seekers create excitement and change. Their brains are geared to detect novelty. And so when things are disrupted and unprepared and new, seekers get more pleasure, as you can see on this little boy's face. Avoiders want more of the same thing and nothing more. Look at this little girl. She's also at the beach, but she has had enough. She's laying on top of a jacket. She's holding her ears. She's kind of curling her body up because she does not want any more sensory input. Avoiders have very low sensory thresholds and active self-regulation, just like seekers. But because they have low thresholds, their brain is geared to detect a lot of input. And when detecting the input, their brains trigger fight or flight because the input is perceived as potentially harmful or dangerous. So avoiders are hypervigilant. They're always trying to stay away from things that are unpredictable. And that is why avoiders are really good at creating routines to keep life manageable, because sameness doesn't trigger those same reactions. Predictability, the brain understands, and so doesn't have to go into a possible fight or flight response. Sensors also have low sensory thresholds, but they have a more passive self-regulation strategy. They try to do things and then can get overwhelmed. Look at this little girl in the picture. Most children are running to get on the slide, to slide down, and we are worrying whether we're going to get to the bottom in time. This little girl is a little bit more pensive. I can imagine her asking questions like, is it going to hurt my legs? Is it going to be too fast? Are you going to be there to catch me? What's it going to feel like? Because her sensor brain is detecting a lot of sensation and she doesn't know what to expect. The good thing about being a sensor is that they have very precise understanding. They notice a lot of cues and they have very good ideas about how to organize and handle situations. They have low sensory thresholds and passive self-regulation. Bystanders have high thresholds and passive self-regulation. Look at this little boy in the picture. The TV's on, his sister is trying to play with him, the dog is there making noise, he's holding a piece of cake. None of this is enough to reach his high thresholds for him to respond. Because of this high threshold and passive self-regulation, bystanders are very easygoing. They're easy to have around because they don't get upset. They miss cues. Their brains are geared with high thresholds, and they do not go after additional sensation like seekers do. So a lot of times they miss things that other people notice. Bystanders can really focus because of this. We are now in the second edition of the sensory profile. The new sensory profile 2 goes from birth to 15 years, is a caregiver report, and so this accommodates some of the early adolescents that still need some parent report because they can't do self-reporting like the adolescent adult sensory profile. So this really helps people that are working with children that have developmental delays that cannot report about themselves. We have 5 forms of a sensory profile 2: the infant, the toddler, the child, the short, and the school companion. You can see that there is a separate color coding for each one, and there are separate forms for each of these, so that if you only serve a certain population, you don't have to buy all the forms. You can just buy the ones that match your group. The sensory profile 2 is very easy to administer, and it's very easy to score because you just mark, based on a raw score, you mark the category that the child's score is in. But it's important to remember that even though it's easy to score, it's still based on the same statistics that you would get from any other test. It's based on the bell curve, and all of the cut scores are based on the categories on the bell curve that you see on other tests. So just like others is the fat part of the bell curve, more and less than others is like the 1 to 2 standard deviation range, and much more than others and much less than others are for those scores that are beyond 2 standard deviations. So you can see comparisons with other tests if you like, without having all the effort of having to look scores up in the manual or do other calculations. So even though we talk about the sensory patterns as if they're each separate, distinct categories of how people behave, it's important to remember that all of us have some amount of each of these sensory patterns. We might have a large amount of avoiding and a small amount of seeking, but we have some amount of each one. I learned this from the temperament and personality literature, which talks about people's personalities and temperaments being the same across their lives because they have studied the actual same people when they're children, adolescents, and adults and seen the same underlying features every time. So let's look at this as an example. So this is the example of an actual single person and their sensory profile patterns. If you went dining with this person, you would say she was a seeker because she looks at adventurous food choices, she looks for spices, she wants variety, she wants to try all the new restaurants. But if you worked with this person, you'd say, no, she's an avoider because she closes her door at the office. She wants you to email her instead of come to the office. She telecommutes when she can. And if you went shopping with this person, you'd say, oh, she's totally a sensor because she's always feeling the textures and very picky about which texture she picks. She feels how heavy accessories are and doesn't want them to move around on her skin. But if you visited this person at their home, you'd say, oh my gosh, she's totally a bystander because she doesn't notice that all the pictures are crooked in her home or that there is some disarray. So all of these are the same person, but we're seeing her in different contexts. And so our experience with this person is different because different parts of our sensory patterns show up depending on what the demands of the activities and the environments are. This points out the importance of the relationship between the person and their context. So sensory processing is really about the space between the person and the context, not the person alone. So if we take this one step further and think about what's the optimal dining experience for a person with each pattern, seekers would want very active venues, maybe a multi-course meal where the plates are coming in and out, or a venue that has entertainment and food with it. People who are sensors are going to want to have a quiet, maybe off-peak hours so there's not as many people, a place where they don't have to wait for their reservation, maybe low lighting, someplace out of the way of the traffic at the restaurant. Avoiders are going to want predictable food. Perhaps an avoider would always want to go to the same location, but they're the most likely to want to do takeout or delivery, or even cook at home and have the same menu from week to week. Bystanders are the universal companion for dining because they're kind of easygoing about wherever they go. So you get your way if you have a bystander to go to dinner with. But bystanders are going to do best in environments that are like seekers because bystanders and seekers have high thresholds, and those really busy environments are going to be more engaging for the bystander to reach their high thresholds since they don't try to reach their thresholds on their own. So let's turn our attention to context. So we have to look at this situation of sensory processing and context in two different ways. First, we have to consider one person in multiple contexts. So on the left, you see the girl at home, at school, at Scouts, and at the park. You know, those are different contexts, and they might bring out different sensory features because of what the context holds or what the context demands of the child. You know, perhaps there's more structure and quiet at school, and the child is sensitive to sound, But when they're at Scouts, it's really more random and busy, and that's a harder environment for the child. So we have to think about the child in every context. Secondly, though, we also have to think about each context and its effect on multiple children, as a teacher would. The teacher has a classroom culture, and he or she has to think about how that particular culture has an effect on every single child in that classroom. You know, loud and busy bulletin boards might be really great for a child that's a visual seeker, but it might be really hard for a child who gets really distracted easily. So the idea that one context can affect different people differently, and the fact that multiple contexts can affect one child differently as well. So here's an example of one child in two different contexts. On the left is a picture of Julio at the playground. This is a very challenging environment for Julio, and so anybody that sees him there is going to describe him in a different way than if you see him at the Science Center, which is on the right, where he's very engaged. It's a little bit more structured. He's very interested in the topic because he likes science, and so he's very focused in. So the gentleman at the Science Center is going to describe Julio a different way than the people that supervise the playground. So this is an important feature for us to think about when we're talking to parents, when we're talking to teachers, like what is going on in the context. And then you and I, with our expertise, can help figure out what the triggers are, what the supports are, to sort of make every environment as friendly to the child as possible. So for example, we could take the structure idea from the Science Center and maybe apply it in some organized activities on the playground to support Julio to be a more positive influence on the playground. So this is an example of the same context and two different children. So these two girls are part of a wedding party. You can see that the girl on the left has had enough. It's just too much. Maybe her dress is bothering her. The sounds are bothering her. She is not happy. And the girl on the right is just delighted to be there. She loves everything about it. So the same context can affect a child in a different way. And these are things that we can help teachers and parents understand so they can become better observers, become more mindful about what the triggers are for their children, and then they can feel more competent as they deal with the children in everyday routines. So I thought you'd like to know what the context actually was. This picture was on the internet, and I know it's a beautiful picture of their wedding, but the royal wedding overshadowed these two little girls having a different experience. So think about it from a sensory perspective and you see something new. So let's look at this a little bit differently. These are three of my friends. The man on the top left of your screen clearly notices that he's putting on a pink and a green shoe and a red and a blue sock. He does this every day. He gets a lot of joy out of it. He also likes bugging his coworkers because they think it's really weird. This is seeker behavior, as opposed to the gentleman on the bottom left, which is a high school teacher who got to school with one brown and one black shoe, one round toe and one square toe shoe, and one slip-on and one tie shoe. The way he noticed it was his students pointing it out. This is clearly bystander behavior. And the thing that's really fun about it is bystanders don't get upset by things like this because they're easygoing. He took a picture of it and he posted it online because he thought it was hilarious as well. So the third picture on the right is a woman who is a jeweler. She does the cut and clarity, very precise work. She's always very groomed. She's very buttoned up. And I was surprised one day when I saw her wearing these shoes that have fur on them, because I always had thought about her being a censor, and censors simply would never wear shoes with fur. So I was feeling a little unsettled about that. And so I asked her, I said, tell me about your shoes. And she lit up and she said, aren't they beautiful? I just think they're so gorgeous. And, so that told me that she's really a seeker for the visual aesthetic of the shoe, the brocade and the fur. It's very well designed. I said to her, I'm really surprised to see that you are wearing shoes with fur. I thought that wouldn't be something you'd be interested in wearing. And she gasped and said, oh my gosh, I could never wear these shoes if I didn't have hose on. And I felt really a lot better because that's an adaptive strategy for a sensor. The hosiery provides touch pressure input to your legs and your feet, which is highly myelinated neurons, and that overrides the sense of light touch that you might get from the fur. A seeker would wear these shoes barefooted to feel the fur all day, but a sensor creates a little bit of a barrier for herself, overriding the fur so she can wear them because they're beautiful to her aesthetically. So this is true about all of us. So I love this quote to kind of sum up from Lorraine Ollie, who wrote an article called You and Your Quirky Kid in Newsweek in 2007. If we examine ourselves and those around us, the husband who shuns picnics because he can't stand the texture of the grass, we have to admit that everyone, to some extent, is odd. What is your oddness? So here's how we find ourselves, all together in the context of the world. The boy in the center is a seeker. He just graduated from college and he's having the day. The avoider is up inside the building with the shutters closed. The bystander is right next to him, but she doesn't notice him going by. And the sensor in the foreground is interrupted from her conversation to see what's going on. We all manage together. And I know that many of you know that I take a strength-based perspective. And so if we look at it from a strengths point of view, seekers create excitement and change all around them. Bystanders are easygoing and maintain their focus. Avoiders create routines to manage the day. And sensors notice details and have precise ideas. Living Sensationally Understanding Your Senses is a book I wrote for the public to help family members and others understand that sensory processing is about everyone. It's not just narrowed to those children who are vulnerable. So since we're talking about context, let's look at some classrooms and other spaces. This is a classroom of an elementary school teacher. Teachers take a lot of pride in their classrooms, and when you walk into them, you can get a sense about what their sensory processing patterns are by how they organize their class. So this teacher has put a lot of effort into this classroom. We can see lots of activities on the walls, and we see materials organized around the edges and on tables. So I like this picture because it gives us an opportunity to talk about how we could organize the space without changing it, because we don't ever want to be disrespectful to a teacher's way of being. How we could adjust some of the things to be in service to children with different needs. So for example, I can see that there's a little carpeted area on the left, but I also notice on the lower right, if you look behind those tables, this teacher has taken the time to put tennis balls on all the chairs in the linoleum area to make the sound less. I would be the first to tell this teacher what a great idea that was. But we might have trouble, for example, with a child that has visual distractibility because of all the busyness. So one of the things I thought of was, if you see at the end of each table group, there's a little table with the books and supplies in those bins. If we move those onto the bigger table, we could put a student at the end and create a visual barrier, even though they're still in their group when they're doing their assignment, that child wouldn't have as many things to look at. We could create a little like study carrel area with those bins. So we wouldn't be changing the teacher's way, but we would be using the teacher's way of being in a way to adjust it. We could also put a child over facing that blackboard on the right to reduce the visual barrier, the visual environment as well. I also thought about the possibility of moving the comfy chair in the center out a little bit and creating a little space behind there. We don't know what's in those bins, so that would be something we'd have to investigate. But I just want you to start looking at environments and thinking about ways we can make adjustments without making the teacher um, make the classroom something that really isn't her way either. We've got to make those adjustments in service to everyone. So this is a very nice preschool room, and I'm happy to see that it's carpeted, which is a really nice thing for preschool because preschoolers are very noisy. But we still have a little boy in the front that's holding his ear, suggesting that there's still some auditory features in this environment that are hard for him. So if you look around, one of the things that I see is that we have all these beautiful wooden shelving units for the children's activities and supplies. But what I know about wooden shelving units is that they're noisy when plastic or wood hits them. Picking things up and putting them down is going to be really noisy. So, one of the ways we can make an adjustment to this environment for this little boy's ability to participate is to cover the shelves with felt or Dyson or something that we can put things on the bottom of the objects themselves to reduce the impact of the sound when the children are picking them up and putting them down. So this is just one example of something we could do that keeps the aesthetic of the environment the teacher has created while also trying to accommodate this little boy in the foreground that needs some of the auditory to be dialed down. So let's consider touch processing in this activity. This teacher has moved the shelving units out and created this space in the back of her classroom for the children to come and do more messy projects. But you can see that we have very close quarters. We have the paint and the smocks. There's a lot of things going on. We could talk about other sensory input, but if we focus just on touch, you'll see that there are a few children at the far end. We could move children more farther apart from each other. I can see the one boy in the blue shirt on the right. Maybe the smock elastic bothers him, and so the teacher has made an accommodation by putting a shirt on him that he can use as a smock. Some of the children are using their fingers, and some of them are using paintbrushes, which gives children the option of how they want to experience the paint. These are all accommodations that are reasonable within the activity and within the setting to make it possible for a child to participate successfully. And they are all sensory processing features that we're adjusting in service to the children. This is a beautiful classroom that has a lot going on. The teacher has clearly put a lot of effort in. It has the advantage of having mostly carpet to make the sound go down. But this is a place, for example, that might be harder for a child that is more distractible visually, or where movement might be more challenging because they could bump into things. If you think about the chairs being out away from the tables, it might be harder. So we might look around this classroom and figure out ways to create a table area that is facing the brick wall on the far side underneath those cubbies, which would be a smaller visual environment for the child. Perhaps we could put a divider. If you look to the left of center, there's a little work table with cubbies on it. Maybe we can put a divider there from the larger part of the room for a child to work. So this is a place where we could say to the teacher, Thomas is distracted by visual stimuli, and you have such an inviting environment for most children, but how can we make some adjustments in here to be in service to him? And partner with the teacher to try to come up with ways to just move the furniture a little bit to make it possible for some children that are distracted to still participate successfully. In contrast, we see a room like this, which has very little extra things, but it's really crowded. And this would be a challenging environment for a child who needs to move. So if we had a student that has is a seeker for movement, this classroom would be very, very challenging. So maybe we could put the child in one of the desk areas right close to the door. We could maybe give that child some jobs of sending messages or taking things back to the library, things that would give the child natural opportunities to move during the course of the class or the school day. They could even maybe go up and down the aisles and hand things out. But being still in this classroom would be really hard for a child who has seeking movement needs. This classroom is also very organized, but in a very different way. Who might do well in this classroom, but who might need some adaptations to thrive here? Because this environment is very organized and tidy and has less extra things on the walls. This might be a more challenging environment for a seeker who needs additional input. So again, we might need to make some adaptations for a child who's a seeker to give them more opportunities to reach their high thresholds without being disruptive as a student in that class. Let's turn our attention to some home environments. So these are two different study areas that a family might have created in their home. Who do you think designed them? On the right side, it looks like somebody who's a seeker who needs lots of input and stimulation throughout the day. It's very bright. There's pictures on one side and books on the other. There's lots of projects around and on the desk. This is an environment that would keep a seeker meeting their high thresholds so they could really focus their attention to do their work. But on the left side, what if you have a parent who creates this workspace for their child, and the parent is a low threshold person, a seeker, a avoider or a sensor, but the child is a seeker. This environment, even though it looks like a place where somebody could really get down and study, this would be a difficult environment for a child who is a seeker because their brains are geared to detect novelty, and with nothing there to detect, their brain's gonna be searching for other things to detect and notice. So we've got to make sure that we help families make adjustments, not because of what the parent needs are, but to be respectful of what the child's needs are, so studying can actually be productive. So in this slide, I want you to click through. There's 4 different environments in different homes. Notice how you react to each one. Which ones would make you feel like working and would make you feel productive, and which ones would just be too much for you? And too much could be that it's too blank for you to be stimulated enough to work. We have to think about carefully what makes a person productive and create or select environments that match. So which ones do you react positively to or negatively to? And which ones, therefore, would be a good match for people with different sensory patterns? We have to think beyond who designed it, because we can see from the design of these rooms that you're going to see, probably the sensory pattern of who designed it. But frequently when we're talking about children, parents are designing things for their children, and they might not have the same sensory patterns. So just take a moment with each picture and decide what you think would be the best possible match and how you could make adjustments based on what you see. Here are some kitchens. One of the kitchens has everything behind the doors and drawers, and the other one has all open shelving. Again, we can hypothesize who might have designed these kitchens. They're both beautiful, but which ones are a good match for different people? Environments matter in how people can participate. If you're distracted by all the things on the shelves, you're not going to be as efficient in the kitchen. But if you're a seeker and you need more novelty, the kitchen on the left is going to be really hard for you to function in. And here are 4 living room spaces. Again, we can hypothesize the patterns of the parents who designed them, But how do we help those parents understand the needs of children who have different sensory patterns than theirs? On the bottom left, perhaps a bystander um, lives there, which is fine for the bystander. But if we have a child with a low sensory threshold, we might have to have a getaway place for that child to have things more organized in a way that is useful to a sensor or an avoider. And conversely, on the upper right, this might not be an environment that is useful for a child who's a seeker. You know, this child might misbehave more in this room, and helping the parents understand to create a space where the child has more stimulation might be in service to their family's well being. So, how do you react to this room? Some of you find it interesting, and other people find it distracting. If you are a movement seeker, this is going to be a challenging environment. If you are distracted by visual input, this is going to be a challenging environment. But if you are a seeker or a bystander, this might be a place where you can really get down to work. How could we make adaptations to this room to accommodate different people in the family? For example, one of the things I thought of was to put a curtain or something that draws open and closed in front of all those shelving units so that it can either be interesting as it is right now, or it can be a little bit calmer for people that have other needs. What ideas do you have about this room? When we think about public places like parks, we still have a lot of variety to think about. Look at these two kinds of parks. One of them is very busy, and one of them is kind of calm. So, how could you help a family make a plan for these two places? You know, downloading the scheme of each park and making a plan about where you're going to go and what you're going to do might be a strategy. And if you click, you can see a map of a park, like you can download from the internet sites of these parks, and make a plan with the family about how they're going to manage and what their strategies are going to be. So another tool you have to consider the sensory aspects of context is in the appendix of the sensory profile too. It's a simple ecological assessment of the environment from a sensory point of view. You can see here the different sensory areas and evaluation of the child's reaction and the environment. So we can evaluate the environment on a 0 to 6 scale. You have to remember to just look at the environment without looking at the reaction you're having or anyone else is having. So 0 means that characteristics absent from that environment, and 6 means it's a very intense version of that sensory input in that context. And then you can turn your attention to the child's reaction to that context. And for this, we have to think about 0 being in the middle where the child seems unaware of the feature and it doesn't seem to affect participation. +3 is that it completely supports the child to participate. And -3 means the child is so focused on that particular sensory feature that it really interferes with their participation. So by looking at the environment itself and the child's reaction, we can get a gauge about the relationship between the child and the particular context where you're doing your observation. So in the subsequent slides, you can see the items for each sensory system that are on the ecological inventory. Look at each set as you click through and think about what environments would have a high or a low amount of these, and which kinds of children would have invitations to participate or barriers to participate based on these particular characteristics. It is helpful for your planning. A final tool for linking sensory processing and the environment and context demands is the activity configuration. In an activity configuration, we look at the time, we look at the routine and what the family or the teacher expects to happen. We observe what is actually happening for the particular child or children we're serving. We see how they're doing it now. We find out what the parents or teachers really want. And then we make some suggestions to make adaptations to support better participation in that particular activity. So sometimes just the act of asking the questions to the teachers and parents gets them thinking about ways they could move furniture around or change the activity a little bit to make it more friendly for particular children. So consider using this one as well. Thanks for sitting in today. I hope you got some ideas about how to look at the environment from a sensory point of view and how to consider what you can do to make the world an easier place for children with all different sensory patterns. And by the way, make it easier for the parents and teachers as well. We all live in a context, and the context helps us understand, but it can also interfere. So be as creative as you can possibly be, and you'll have fun. Just like all these kids are. Bye.